This week we're looking at the road to Emmaus from the Gospel of Luke. Not many people are familiar with this story, I've come to discover. Um, my three sons have biblical names, and my youngest is Emmaus. And anytime we would pronounce his name, people would look at me like, "What is that? And where did you get that name?" It's from this story. It's another one of my favorites. Emmaus is a story of people journeying with Jesus. And I wish more people would recognize this story and be part of it, because it's a very profound telling of our relationship with Jesus and how we interact with Jesus. A lot of people are familiar when it comes to road stories, of course, with the road to Damascus and Paul's big experience with the light shining and Jesus saying, "Why are you condemning me?" and the whole thing. But we've got another road story here with Emmaus. Just to contextualize it a little bit, the story as we read it is usually read when on Easter evening. So if you're not part of a tradition that has an Easter evening service, then you probably haven't heard this story, at least not frequently. But it's set Easter evening. Now the people who are in the story, the travelers, they have been to Jerusalem for Passover, but they were disciples of Jesus. So they were in the upper room. They watched Jesus on Maundy, Thursday. They were part of the horror of Good Friday, watching it happen. They witnessed Jesus' death. They were in Jerusalem long enough on Sunday morning to hear that the women had gone to the tomb and discovered it empty, but they had nothing after that. And they left town, as did most pilgrims who had been in Jerusalem for Passover. They left to go back to their home, and their home was in Emmaus. So if you picture Jerusalem here, Emmaus would be right down here. So they went to Jerusalem for the celebration, but they also were part of the bigger Easter story. And they didn't wait in Jerusalem to find out what happened afterwards. They left and they were walking down the road. And as they got closer and closer to their home, they were joined by others. Now this was not unusual, because society in that day was kind of close. They even if they didn't recognize each other, it was an agrarian society. You were nice to people because you never knew when you needed to depend on them. It's a big difference between country folk and city folk. City folk were independent. They didn't see that they needed anybody. Country folk understood they need each other. So it was not uncommon for them walking down a road, traveling together, for someone else to join them. It was also about safety and security, because roads were not a safe place to be. Travelers had to be in groups, and it had to be in the middle of the day, because you never knew when a bandit was out there and would get to you. It could happen at any time, mostly at night, because of course cover of darkness would hide a lot. So journeying down the road, not unusual. Meeting up with someone who wants to walk with you, not unusual. Chatting it up about the day and what's happened and how are you, again, not unusual. We do that all the time. But this person wasn't recognized by the two travelers. They were just chatting away, and he said, "So why are you so upset?" And they said, "Don't you know what's happened?" And he got into this whole conversation with them about them saying they really believed Jesus was the guy, and that when he died, they couldn't believe that their hopes and dreams were over, and they were so disheartened. They had put energy. They were disciples. They were followers. They paid attention. They'd been with Jesus who knows how long. Not as long as the original 11 and 12 had, but they'd been with Jesus for some time and knew of what was going on. And they had stayed long enough to hear the first resurrection stories, but they didn't know anything else. They got out of town, which at that time, being a Jesus follower was probably a really smart thing to do, because none of them knew if they were going to be next. So then this traveler that they join with starts to say, don't you believe the scriptures? Don't you believe what's going to happen? And really challenging them as they just casually walk down the road. And when they get to their home, they invite the stranger in. Now, again, not unusual. Acts of hospitality were expected in that society, especially at nighttime. You did not let a lone traveler walking down the road in the evening. No, you didn't do that. So they invited him into their home. And it wasn't until Jesus picked up the bread and broke it that they recognized him. And then Jesus was gone. We talk about bodily resurrection, but all of the experiences that the disciples have after resurrection are that Jesus appears and then Jesus leaves. There's no doors open and closed. There's no windows to jump through. There's no hocus pocus going on either. Jesus just appears and leaves. Physically there, engaged in the world around, like Thomas we saw yesterday, touchable, huggable, knowing he's there. But as soon as they are aware, Jesus goes. And the reason the road to Emmaus is so profound is because it mirrors so many of our experiences as Christians. I went to a lot of conferences back in the 90s where people were talking about this road to Damascus experience and how you had to have this big thing. And if you were not having this thing, this overwhelming experience, were you really a Christian? And it used to sit in my craw. And people would tell me straight up to my face that if you were a cradle Christian, meaning someone who was born into the faith, then you couldn't really be a full Christian because it wasn't your choice. And there's a number of anti-Christian attitudes that also include that. If you're born up to be a Christian, you can't choose anything different because you have been brainwashed into believing this, and there's nothing else you can do about it. I really resent that too, because there's nothing. If you are not using your brain in your faith, then something's not going on for you, because you have to think about it. Your questioning, your disbelief is all part of your development. So this notion that if we are raised Christian, if we are never experiencing a falling away from the church, if we maybe get bored and turn away, but still consider ourselves Christian, if we show up at Easter and Christmas and still do the prayers and know them and participate as much as possible, but have a really personal spirituality, you're still Christian. You don't have to have this huge experience. You don't have to be an every week, every service, every moment attender. You don't have to be a Bible thumper. You don't have to be someone who can quote the scripture at the drop of a hat. Those are just parlor tricks. Those really don't mean anything, because the relationship with Jesus is really personal in a communal setting. We can't be Christians in isolation, because so much of what Christianity is about relationship, and so much about what God is relationship. But when we're by ourselves in those quiet moments, it is just us and God. And the road to Emmaus really challenges us to look at our journey, our own personal journeys. If you're someone who has had that huge Damascus experience, I don't want to lessen that, because that's really significant. You have had something happen in your life that you needed something big to return you to Christ. But if you've never had that experience, if you've just gone comfortably, quietly through Christianity, maybe encountered preachers like me who push you and challenge you to think differently, but you've never had a moment of losing faith or challenging, or think it's not something you want to be pursuing for the rest of your life, that's okay. Because the road to Emmaus gives us this quiet journey with Jesus. And Jesus asks questions and engages us, and the conversation is back and forth. And then, when we sit down together for a meal, and a meal is just as important today as it was 2,000 years ago. It's part of communion. It's part of community. I mean, we're all in a pandemic situation where we're locked away. And what's the number one thing we want to do with other people besides hug the children that don't live in our homes with us anymore and our parents? We want to have coffee. We want to get together for family meals. We want to go out to a restaurant. Food is very, very important in our relationship. And that's why the Eucharist is so important. Communion is so important in recognizing Jesus in our midst, like the road to Emmaus. Jesus picked up the bread, blessed it, broke it, gave it, and aha! They figured it out. This is Jesus. Jesus the whole time. And then they started talking. Jesus had disappeared at this point. But they started talking. It's like, wasn't our heart beating strongly? Didn't we feel that fire in us like we had before? And then they rushed back to Jerusalem. Now remember, nighttime, going on a road through the dark, 7 miles. Not wise, but they did it. And they rushed back to where the other apostles were gathered. And the 11 specifically are mentioned. And when they get to the upper room, they burst in and they hear the story that Jesus has just appeared to Peter. So we hear Simon, we assume Simon Peter. And there's no story of Jesus appearing to Peter in the Gospels. Paul makes reference to it in one of his letters. But it's another sighting. And then these two who had gone to Emmaus and came right back, they talked about their own personal experience of Jesus being alive. And it adds to the wealth of experiences from Thomas to Mary to all of them who have had this personal encounter. They knew Jesus as a person before his death. They had a vision of him, an encounter with him, of a significant moment of change with him after resurrection. And these collectively are what the Christian community has gathered up as these resurrection narratives to tell us about Jesus appearing for each other. Now, since Ascension, we've not had an experience of Jesus appearing, save Paul's experience on the road to Damascus. But we don't have to wait for them. In the breaking of bread, we're invited to see Jesus. In the communal aspect of getting together, just chatting it up with a friend or a stranger, we're invited to see Jesus. We don't have to stay in our cocoons. We don't have to stay ignorant of Jesus' encounters in our community. We don't have to worry that we're not doing it right, because there's no right way to encounter Jesus so long as you do. The community that we're starving for right now is the community that helps us understand Jesus better. But there's no reason why we can't have Jesus in our midst through prayer, through meditation, through all sorts of ways that are far more individual and far more private. But the breaking of bread is particularly significant. It's where our hearts live. It's where our families gather. It's where people who are desperate look first for support and community. It's a shame of modern Christianity. It's one of our greatest sins, actually, that the act of the Lord's Supper, of communion, of Eucharist, is the dividing line between Christians of all denominations. We recognize each other's baptisms, each other's marriages. Aside from those on the outside fringe, we will go to each other's services and maybe not feel at home because we don't know what's necessarily going on, but we recognize the flow, we recognize the scriptures, we recognize the message. But when it comes to breaking bread together, that most primal thing that Jesus asked us to do, we divide into our own camps again. And Orthodox, Catholic, Reformed, Reformation, Anabaptist, we all do things differently when it comes to the breaking of bread. And I think if we could get over ourselves that way and start to share a meal, we probably would have more encounters of Jesus with each other. There's something incredibly profound about that moment when bread is broken. Years and years ago, decades ago actually, I represented Canada at a conference in Louisiana, Kentucky, and it was a student conference down there. And the entire week, everybody was kind of interacting with each other, and they would be at each other's rooms and celebrating and worshiping together. And there was no great dividing lines among us. But we came to Eucharist at the end of the week. And we came into the auditorium that had been just a big free-for-all for the entire time. But we came in, and suddenly the Presbyterians were sitting in one place, and the United Church of Christ, because this is America, was sitting in one place, and the Moravians were sitting in a place, and the Methodists were sitting in a place, and everybody was sectioned off. And the White Baptists and the Black Baptists weren't sitting together, although the Black Baptists were the ones running the music section. And it was wrong. It felt very, very wrong. And those of us in the international community, must have been about 20 of us. I mean, Ecuador, Poland, Egypt, Australia, I can't remember how many of us, how many countries were represented, but there's 20 of us. We're sitting way up high above everybody else at the very back. So we were not connected to what was going on the floor at all. The messaging of the room was exclusion. We were left out. Everybody was isolated. But a really interesting thing started happening as communion happened. The music team started playing Amazing Grace, which is the universal for English Christians, and maybe Christians of other parts of the world as well, to get up and engage. They started playing it, not singing it, just playing it, as communion was happening. And it was I won't say it was dirge-like, but it was not inspiring playing for sure. And suddenly what started to happen is as those who were getting up for intinction, so to go and line up and dunk your bread, as they got up, the Presbyterians who'd been sitting down because they're used to being served would get up and join the lines. And then others who were used to standing up would go and sit where the Presbyterians were. And eventually everybody, all the students, came into each other's spaces. And those of us, the international students, were watching this. We had a great vantage point for this. And all the leadership were at the front, trying to keep everybody separate and looking back and forth and not knowing what's going on. And the music is just getting wilder and wilder, and everybody knows the lyrics to at least one verse of Amazing Grace. So we were singing it, and it got louder, and the energy was amazing. Eventually, the leadership kind of got a clue and started serving each other, which they should have been doing from the start. But the students were not having any of this divide. We were celebrating the Lord's Supper, the taking of bread, the blessing, the breaking, and the sharing. And I got to tell you, Jesus was in that room. The Spirit was in that room. It's perhaps one of the most profound spiritual experiences of my life, and I've had a number of them. We divide ourselves artificially. We're not community the way we're called to be in the very simplest things, like breaking bread, like talking to each other, like walking down a road. The resurrection story that we hear from Emmaus, the resurrection story we hear from all sorts of people, the experience of 2,000 years of Christianity is that Jesus is with us, often in that small, quiet walk down the road. Means we're journeying, we're going forward, we're learning more, we're becoming better at who this thing is that we call Christianity. But we're not divided. We are a group of people who have the opportunity, as we get together, to have Jesus in our midst. And even if we physically can't get together right now, we can spiritually get together and share this message that Jesus is with us. Chances are, as soon as we realize Jesus is with us, he's gone. Because, like a bubble in the water, you can't put your finger on it. It will just evaporate and disappear, move on. But what's left is that profound spiritual experience, that burning almost in your heart, that these two on the way to Emmaus felt. And that is the encounter with the Spirit. And it is possible for everybody. You don't have to be in a large venue. I told you I had many spiritual experiences. Some of them have been with friends. Some of them have been by myself. When we open ourselves up to that, when we invite Jesus in, when we invite the stranger in, When we speak scripture, when we read, when we pray, when we meditate, when we open ourselves to that energy, amazing things are going to happen. And then we too can say, we have had an experience with the living Lord. And that's resurrection.